Now that we are done with the discussion about elasticity of demand and how we can determine or what are the factors that affect elasticity of demand, we are well set to talk about the usefulness of elasticity of demand. One such usefulness is determination of revenue. Now, what is revenue? We say revenue or total revenue, TR, is equal to price times quantity. And it is telling us how much expenditure a consumer does or what income, in other words, firm will make. So for example, if I make a demand curve, right, and if I tell you currently the price of the good is, for example, $5, and the quantity that the firm sells at that $5 is, for example, 10 units, that would mean if you look at total revenue for this firm, that will be P times Q, or $50. So the revenue of a firm is simply price times quantity, and this revenue is also called expenditure for the consumer or income for the producer. So three names for the same thing: total revenue, total expenditure, or total income. Now, total revenue has an important role to play, because when you look at your profit is simply total revenue minus total cost, right? So if I look at my equation for profit, my profit is simply total revenue minus total cost. And if total revenue goes up, we know that the firm's profit will go up. So total revenue depends significantly on elasticity of demand, and this discussion will tell you how, when the elasticity changes, we will see total revenue to also change. So let's start with our first case of a perfectly inelastic demand, which has elasticity demand equal to zero, right? We saw this in an earlier discussion, that when you look at an inelastic demand which is perfectly inelastic, means that PED is equal to zero, but demand curve is completely vertical, which means any change in price, if the price goes up, for example, from P0 to P1 by let's say 10%, the quantity doesn't change at all. There's no change in quantity. So what happens to revenue for such a good? Let's say if I'm selling a perfectly inelastic good. Remember, the example for perfectly inelastic good is a life-saving drug, something as important as a life-saving drug, where you are not cutting down your quantity or changing your quantity to a change in price. So for example, if the quantity is 10, and let's say the price was also 10 before, and now 10% increase of 10 will make the price to be 11, what will happen to revenue? You can see the revenue before was, let's call it TR naught, the revenue before was P naught times Q, which is equal to simply 10 times 10, or 100, right? But now when the price goes up from 10 to 11, the new total revenue is actually going to be P1 times Q, or in other words 11 times 10, or let me write 11 times 10, or $110. So what you can see here is this, that because the quantity isn't changing, the revenue is changing because of the price. So the higher the price, right, the higher the price, the higher will be your revenue, as quantity demanded is not changing at all. So in other words, here what we can say, or we can argue this, is that total revenue, let me write this also, total revenue is a function of, or depends on, is a function of price. The higher the price, the higher will be the total revenue. Now let's look at the case of a relatively inelastic good. For a relatively inelastic good, we will realize the same phenomenon that we notice for perfectly inelastic good, that price has a strong role to play. So whenever there is an increase in price, there will also be an increase in total revenue. Why does that happen? Let's first see the diagram of the inelastic good. We've discussed that also in an earlier video when we were looking at inelastic goods and very steep diagram for demand curve. So if you look at the demand curve, when the price of the good goes up, we saw, let's say if the price goes up by 10%, we saw the quantity was going down from Q0 to Q1 by less than 10%, by, let's say, for example, 5%, which would mean that if the price goes up, quantity falls by much less as compared to price, and as a result of that, total revenue goes up because your quantity is falling by much less, but the price is going by much more. And if you look at this in short, guys, if you look at this area, P0 times Q0, which is the revenue before this rectangle that is formed, versus P1 times Q1, you will realize that P1 times Q1 is much more than P0 times Q0, which is because that the quantity just fell by 5% when the price went up by much more. So when the good is inelastic because it's habit forming, because it has few substitutes available, we do not see the quantity to fall by that much to an increase in price. For such goods, the total revenue rises when the price goes up, making the producer to make a lot of money. Let's now look at the case of a unitary elastic demand curve. In the case of a unitary elastic demand curve, we know this that PED is equal to 1, which means that the percentage change in quantity demanded is exactly equal to percentage change in price. And we discussed this earlier that this kind of a good has a demand curve that is non-linear. In fact, the shape is called a rectangular hyperbola, which means that if you look at the good, if we draw the diagram for this good, it has total revenue unchanged because percentage change in price and percentage change in quantity are equal. So for example, if my price goes down from, let's say, P0 to P1, right, by 10%, there's an equal and opposite change in quantity demanded. So if the quantity price is going down by 10%, the quantity will go up by 10%, right? And as a result of this, the rectangle that is formed, and this is why the name rectangular hyperbola, the rectangle that is formed, which is P0 times Q0, is exactly equal to P1 times Q1. So total revenue is actually unchanged. So irrespective of whatever the producer do to price, total revenue remains unchanged because the percentage change in quantity demanded is exactly equal to percentage change in price. For relatively elastic goods, we know this that the elasticity of demand lies between 1 and infinity, which means percentage change in quantity demanded is greater than percentage change in price.
Quick pause. If you're finding value in this explanation, there's so much more to discover. At Alt Academy, we break down every A-level concept with the same level of clarity. Now, let's continue.
So for these kind of goods where quantity is much more responsive to a change in price, we know this. The reason is simply because these goods have more substitutes available. It is easy for consumers to alter their consumption pattern. These goods are not necessities and so on. So for these kind of goods, whenever the price goes down, the quantity will go up by much more, and as a result of that, when the quantity goes up by much more, the total revenue also goes up. So producers are actually better off lowering the price of these goods because when they lower the price, a lot of consumer will be attracted to buy these goods. The quantity will rise by much more, and that will make the total revenue to go up. Let's see that also in a diagram. So when you look at the diagram for relatively elastic goods, we learned earlier that we need to make a demand curve that is very flat rather than steep, because we want to show the idea that if the price changes, for example, from P0 to P1, if the price is going down, let's say by 10%, the quantity will go up by much more, let's say 20%. And because of this, the rectangle that we have in terms of P1 times Q1 is greater than the rectangle that is formed, which is P naught times Q naught. In other words, total revenue after, which is TR1, is greater than total revenue before, which is TR naught. So this rectangle will be smaller as compared to the rectangle P1 times Q1. And so if you're a producer of of a elastic good, you are better off lowering your price in order for you to increase your total revenue. The last case that we would like to discuss is that of a perfectly elastic good. We know for perfectly elastic goods, uh, we have a case where the firm has no control over the price. Why? Because the firm is what we call a price taker. It can sell at any quantity at the market price. So, for example, if the market price for potatoes is $10 per kg, then a producer can sell any quantity, be it Q naught or Q1, at the market price, but he can't control the price. And why is that so? Because there's so many firms in the market, there's so much competition, there are perfect substitutes available in the market. So you can only increase your revenue if you sell more. So, for example, if I'm selling Q naught, my revenue will be total revenue will be P naught or P times Q naught, right? But if, for example, I want to make more money, if I want to make more revenue, I can sell more. So my revenue will be P times Q1. So, in short, what I'm trying to say here is this, that whenever you're selling a perfectly elastic good, revenue only depends on the quantity, because price is not in our control. So, the higher the quantity sold, the higher will be the revenue. As for a producer who is selling a perfectly elastic good, he needs to sell only at the market going price. Now let's look at revenue for downward sloping demand curve. When you look at a downward sloping demand curve, one concept that I would like to talk about is that in a downward sloping demand curve, the elasticity does not stays constant. It varies throughout the length of the demand curve. In fact, on this point of the demand curve, the highest possible price demand is completely elastic, while in the middle it is unitary elastic, and when the price is zero, it's perfectly inelastic or zero. So elasticity actually falls as price goes down, and I'll talk about this in 1 minute. But when the elasticity falls, when the price goes down, this means that as the price goes down, it becomes from perfectly elastic to unitary, and then to inelastic, and then perfectly inelastic. In fact, elasticity falls when the price is going down. And one reason why this happened, guys, is remember we talked about the reasons of why elasticity uh, changes, or determinants of elasticity. So one reason why this happens is simply because as the price goes down, the proportion of income spent on a good goes down. So lower the price, lower the proportion of income spent, and therefore lower will be the responsiveness or elasticity of demand. Now, this has an implication on revenue as well, because if you look at this, guys, when we just learned this, when the good is elastic, what do you do in order to make the revenue go up? And the answer is, when the good is elastic, the lower the price, the higher the total revenue. So if I lower down, if I just make my total revenue graph, if this is my total revenue on my y-axis and quantity on my x-axis. So if you look at this, so for the upper half where the good is elastic, right? For the upper half, which where the good is elastic, guys, you will agree with me that if we lower the price, because the good is elastic, percentage change in quantity demanded will be much more. And so when we lower the price, total revenue should go up. On the other hand, when we keep on lowering my price, so when the price goes down from, let's say, p, let's call this 1 to p naught to 0, as I keep on lowering my price, so in the upper half, because the good was elastic and I was lowering my price, total revenue went up because percentage change in quantity demanded was more than percentage change in price. If the good is actually inelastic, which is the lower half, what if I keep on lowering my price then? Well, we know this. If the good is inelastic, when the price goes down, the percentage change in quantity demanded is much less. And so when the price goes down, the quantity goes up by much less, leading to a fall in total revenue. So it actually results in total revenue fall. So in short, when you have a downward sloping demand curve and you keep on lowering price for the first half till Q naught, you will see the good is elastic and therefore total revenue goes up. And then later on, when the good is inelastic, total revenue goes down, leading to uh, this kind of a total revenue curve. So, where is total revenue maximum? That's the next question we ask, and the answer is at the middle, right in the middle, when the elasticity is equal to 1, price P naught, you will see total revenue to be maximum. So, if your goal is to maximize total revenue, you should produce at the quantity Q naught.
If you found that helpful, imagine what you could achieve with the full economics course. Over 60,000 students have used All Academy to transform their A levels journey. Don't wait and take the first step today.